afternoon. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. It's a real privilege to be part of this distinguished panel and the program overall today. I should mention at the outset here that the research that this presentation is based on is joint with a colleague at the University of Maine, Todd Gave. And the big research question we're really trying to tackle in this project is, why do we see that some regions within the same country grow and thrive while others seem to stagnate and even decline in some cases? Really, to boil it down to the simplest level, what we're trying to understand here is, why is Boston just so different from Buffalo, for example? And for the football fans in the audience who are immediately thinking about tonight's kickoff in the Bills-Patriots game, it's actually a lot more involved than that. What we're going to point to is differences in human capital. Not just the amount of human capital, which Professor Ehrlich's done a great job of stressing already, but the types of human capital that are in regions. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So again, the research question we have here is, what's the relationship between the stock of human capital and the level of economic activity in U.S. metropolitan areas? In order to answer that question, we're going to utilize new data from the U.S. VEA that measure GDP at the metropolitan area level. As we've seen earlier today, you can see that GDP at the country level apparently goes back into the 1800s. It's only very recently, within the last year or two, that GDP down to the metro area level has been published, and so we're going to take advantage of that. We're also going to develop new knowledge-based measures of human capital that are going to complement the existing conventional measures, usually based on educational attainment. We're going to make an argument that the two together are going to be better than one on their own. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is provide a little bit of a snapshot or a window into some of New York's metropolitan areas and how New York's metropolitan areas stack up along our new measures. So just to give you a sense for how economic activity is distributed in the U.S., this shows the distribution of GDP per capita across 363 metros. You can see that it's very uneven. In fact, if you look top to bottom, there's actually a five-fold difference in the level of economic activity in U.S. metropolitan areas. Places like McAllen, Texas, being at the bottom, and Bridgeport, Connecticut at the top. Focusing on some of the metropolitan areas in New York, you see Elmira, New York toward the bottom. Buffalo, New York, somewhere in the middle, not quite average. Places like Albany and Rochester, a little bit brighter for the upstate region. Those are definitely the two most productive areas. And then places like Boston and New York City, among the most productive, highest amounts of economic activity in the country. So why is that? Well, a leading explanation, again, this is sort of the cross-sectional version of what Professor Ehrlich showed you already from a time series standpoint, is that human capital explains a lot. What this shows is the amount of human capital in a region, here measured by educational attainment, the fraction of the population with a college degree or above, is a good explanatory predictor of the level of economic activity across U.S. metropolitan areas. This is just a simple correlation, but this relationship holds controlling for investments in physical capital. It holds taking into account agglomeration economies. It holds using a variety of statistical techniques that take into account endogeneity issues that go with people moving around, especially highly skilled people moving around. It's a very, very powerful and permanent predictor in the economy. And if you look across, you can see for some of our metros, Elmira, Buffalo, as you increase the amount of human capital, as theory would predict, you see higher levels of economic activity. So why is that? What are the economic foundations that explain this? Well, first, this is pretty straightforward. Human capital increases individual level of productivity. So by extension, if you were to just look at it from a regional standpoint, if you've got more people with high levels of human capital, you're going to get more productivity. Skilled workers produce more goods and services for the same amount of inputs, but also importantly, they produce higher value added goods and services. But that's only part of the story. Another important part of the story is that there's human capital spillovers. I'm actually more productive if I'm surrounded by other people who are also highly skilled. Workers gain knowledge by interacting with other people, and you can generate ideas by interacting with other people, and it's been shown that that leads to higher levels of productivity as well. So it's not just the individual level, but spillovers into the local economy as well. And our insight, or our extension of the literature, really looks at these two things and says, well, it may be the case that not all human capital is the same, and that the impact on economic activity may vary by the type of human capital that you have. Okay, so measuring human capital. Talk a little bit about that. So the standard way, at least from the regional economic standpoint, is to use educational attainment. This is called vertical differentiation. And we've talked a lot about education as a way to measure and get a sense for human capital at the regional level. But that's not the only way that people acquire human capital, and that's certainly a limitation in existing work. However, it's very difficult to get a sense about the kinds of skills people have, because unlike a college degree, you can't just observe the kinds of skills that are in the workforce. And so our strategy for this particular paper is to take a look at the occupations that are actually in a workforce. And from the occupations, we know the types of skill and knowledge requirements that are needed in order to perform those occupations. And through that, you can take a look at the occupational structure of metropolitan areas to actually build new measures of the human capital stock that's there. So that's our strategy, and let me give you a sense for what we did. So first of all, what are the types of knowledge that are available? Well, we didn't make this up. This is a data set that the Department of Labor puts out called Onet, the Occupational Information Network. And it provides information on the knowledge requirements for hundreds of occupations along these 33 knowledge areas. What's nice about this is that some of these knowledge areas are clearly associated with obtaining the type of human capital through, say, formal training. Math, medicine and dentistry, the sciences, engineering and technology. There's also a really broad set of knowledge areas that we can measure that typically you acquire the human capital through things like experience, for example, administration and management, or even through other forms of training, construction, production type of work, etc. So by focusing on this, we're going to really get a nice broad cross-section of the types of knowledge and human capital in metropolitan areas. So how do we actually do this? This is an example from the Onet Questionnaire. This is for mathematics. This data set is collected through a series of surveys. It's usually a 2-question survey for, again, hundreds of occupations, where first the respondents asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how important the specific area of knowledge is to their job. And then after that, they're asked, assuming it's important at all to them, what the level of importance is. This is obviously quite important to have both of these, because this can differentiate between someone who's, say, a cashier and an engineer. Both would probably agree that having math is an important part of their job, but the level is going to obviously vary quite a bit for those two occupations. So we're going to use these measures at the individual occupation level, construct an index, which is just the product of the two. And then once we have that for a whole host of occupations, we can then create an overall index at the metropolitan area level by combining across occupations and coming up with measures that reflect more or less the type of knowledge that's in metropolitan areas. Okay, so just to cut to the chase, what did we find in our work? Out of the 33, we found that there was 14 knowledge areas that tended to be associated with high levels of economic activity. Things like administration and management, economics and accounting, mathematics, computers, things that we've all talked about already today as being drivers of the new economy. Now, if you were to pull away from this and try to sort of say, what do these types of knowledge usually contribute to, the message that we see out of this is that several of these types of knowledge contribute to what we call producer services, right? And so producer services are services like accounting and legal services, consulting services that help companies become more productive and have significant spillovers into the economy. And the other thing we see if we pull out is that knowledge areas that tend to be associated with information technology, which have those same basic principles, they tend to have large spillovers with them and help other people become more productive, really are important drivers of the new economy. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll focus on a little bit how do the New York Metro stack up according to our measures. And I'm just going to focus on those 14 knowledge areas given time limits. And the way to read this chart is any bar that's actually above 0 means that the area in that specific knowledge area, the metropolitan area in that specific knowledge area is above average. Anything below 0 means below average. So this is Elmira, New York. And remember, Elmira, New York is one of the lower metropolitan areas with respect to economic activity, and across the board, from high to low, for the areas that tend to be associated with the highest levels of economic activity, Elmira, New York tends to rate out below average, particularly in some of the most important, some of the knowledge areas that are associated with the highest levels of economic activity. So what about a place like Buffalo, New York? The story with Buffalo is a little bit more mixed. Nothing really stands out here as being too far above, too far below average. Certainly, if you look at the top of the distribution, the areas that are the highest, associated with the highest levels of economic activity, Buffalo is about average. Where Buffalo does stand out a little bit are things like computers and electronics, things like clerical, and that tends to really suggest, really what the economy is specializing in right now is a lot of back office type support work for larger banks and financial institutions. Well, how about Albany? Albany's got a much different story. It's a much more vibrant economy. If you were to focus in on it's out of the 14, it's got positive, above average levels in 10 of the 14. And if you were to just focus in on the top 4, higher than average, and in some cases even one standard deviation above average. If you were to focus in on some of the industries that are here, you can see that computers and electronics stands out, reflecting some of the technology that's in the area. But of course, things like economics and accounting and clerical and law and government, they all tend to go along with the types of services that a state capital would typically be associated with producing. And back to the original question, what about Boston? Well, this is what Boston looks like. You can see that Boston, across the board, not only has a lot of human capital, but it tends to be focused in areas that are highly valuable in terms of GDP per capita. More or less across the board, Boston's got very high levels of human capital in some of the most important areas. These bars that are going up to 2 mean 2 standard deviations above the mean, which is really pretty remarkable. And then if you were to just to wrap this up a little bit, if you were to take all of these different knowledge areas and try to create a single index, this is what we've done here, and then just relate it again against per capita GDP, you can see that, in addition to educational attainment, you can see that the types of skills that you have in your area are also quite important as well. So let me just wrap up here. So what do we find? Well, the amount of human capital in a region explains much of the differences in economic activity across U.S. metropolitan areas. But it's not just the amount, it's the type of human capital that matters. And in our study, what we found and what we pointed to is that knowledge that's associated with the provision of producer services and information technology tends to be pretty important in the new economy. And thinking about New York's metropolitan areas, we find that many of New York's metropolitan areas, particularly in the upstate region, tend to have below average amounts of human capital in the areas associated with the highest levels of economic activity. So with that, thank you very much.